As our attendees trickle in, what I might do is just get started with introductions and a little bit about the GloDerm Trainee Committee. So welcome everybody to the GloDerm Trainee Committee February webinar. Today we are delighted to have Professor Chris Griffiths and Associate Professor Esther Freeman discussing disease registries and how to leverage them to do research as a trainee. So welcome. So today you will have myself, Sidra Khan, I'm a dermatology trainee in Manchester, and Rachel Lubinga, a medical student in the USA, as your hosts. We are here from the GloDerm Trainee Committee. So for those of you who are not familiar, the GloDerm Trainee Committee is the trainee arm of GloDerm, the International Alliance for Global Health Dermatology. Our aim is to promote knowledge equity by improving access for dermatology education for trainees from around the world. We aim to provide free educational events and opportunities to build networks and collaborate. Welcome today. Today is our first research, leadership and management webinar, and what you can expect over the coming months. Next month, we have our webinar on teledermatology, and we have only just recently confirmed the date, so you can put that in your diary. It is the 14th of March at 2 p.m. Then the following month, we will be conducting a webinar on medical education. Just a little bit of meeting etiquette for today. So due to the platform that we're using, Zoom webinar, your audio and your video will automatically be off. However, we do encourage you to participate, and you can with any questions or comments using the chat function. Our speakers will answer any of the questions and respond to comments at the end of the webinar. We have a dedicated 20 minutes set aside for that. And throughout the meeting, we also will be sharing some information about GloDerm and the GloDerm Trainee Committee and any upcoming events in our chat function. So as I said today, we are delighted to have Professor Chris Griffiths and Associate Professor Esther Freeman discussing leveraging disease registries to do research as a trainee. Our first speaker today is Professor Chris Griffiths. He's appointed to the Foundation Chair in Dermatology at the University of Manchester in 1994 and founded the Manchester Dermatopharmacology Unit and Manchester Psoriasis Service that same year. In 2015, he received the Sir Archibald Gray Medal for Outstanding Service to British Dermatology, and in 2019, the British Society for Investigative Dermatology Medal for contributions to research. In 2018, Professor Griffiths was awarded Pro Emeritus of the European Dermatology Forum and was appointed an OBE for services to dermatology in the Queen's New Year's Honours. He is also a Fellow of the Academy of Medical Sciences. Professor Griffiths is a previous president of the European Society for Dermatological Research, the British Association of Dermatologists, and the International Psoriasis Council, for which he co-founded in 2004. He is also director of the MRC Stratified Medicine Consortium on Psoriasis, director of the Global Psoriasis Atlas, and chief investigator for the BAD Biologics Immunomodulators Register, BADBIR, which he will be discussing today. He has over 700 PubMed cited articles and is editor-in-chief of Rook's Textbook of Dermatology. He runs international courses on art appreciation for clinicians and is active in global health initiatives, including co-founding the Burma Skincare Initiative charity and special advisor on global health research and policy to the International League of Dermatological Societies. He is also a dear friend of the GloDerm Trainee Committee and champion. He actually gave one of our very first webinars last year, which we were just discussing before everyone came on, and we are so delighted to have him back today. After Professor Griffiths, we will have Associate Professor Dr. Esther Freeman speaking. Dr. Freeman is a physician scientist performing epidemiological research in the area of HIV and HIV dermatology and global health. Her particular area of interest is HIV-associated malignancies, including Kaposi sarcoma. She has received the most highly cited author award in epidemiology and AIDS. She is a consultant to the World Health Organization in Geneva in the area of HIV-associated skin disease and is Director of Global Health Dermatology at MGH. Since 2020, Dr. Esther Freeman has been researching the effects of COVID-19 on the skin in collaboration with the American Academy of Dermatology and the International League of Derm Societies. In addition to her research papers on COVID-19, her work has been cited extensively in the lay press, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and National Public Radio. And you will, of course, know Dr. Freeman as chair of GloDerm, the International Alliance of Global Health Dermatology, which is, of course, our parent organization. Dr. Freeman actually found our trainee group trying to make a small splash on social media about 2 years ago now, and took us in under her wings and really helped nurture and support this group. So our GloDerm trainee community would just not exist today without her support. So she's been hugely instrumental in our journey. And yeah, we're so delighted to have both of you speak today. So I'll stop talking and hand it over to our speakers now. Prof, I think you're still on mute.
Can you see this now? Yeah.
Yes.
Great. So thank you so much, Sidra, for inviting me back. Obviously, I didn't make too much of a mess of it last time when I spoke to you about pustular psoriasis. I think this is just such a fantastic initiative, and I'm very much looking forward to, as I was saying to Dr. Freeman just before we started, looking forward to attending the GLODERM meeting in Boston next month. So nice to be at an in-person meeting. So I'm going to kick things off and talk about the value of patient registries, and begin by describing to you what real-world evidence is, because that's what registries are all about. And then two registries which I've been very heavily involved with. First one, Bad Beer, and the second two, which will run together, So Protect and So Protect Me, which are about COVID and psoriasis. So first up then, what is real-world evidence? And I think that there's various ways of describing it, but the International Society for Pharmacoeconomics and Outcomes Research, ISPOR, so looks at what real-world data is out there. And it's real-world data that's derived from multiple sources, which are outside randomized clinical trials. And this is the key point. And these can come from a variety of different sources, such as observational studies or registries or electronic health records. And the FDA framework also describes real-world evidence, which again is clinical evidence derived from analysis of real-world data. So what we're dealing with registries, for the most part, is not the sort of nice, clear, clean data that you get out of randomized controlled trials, but the very messy but very important data that you get from looking at people in the real world, which is after all how we look after our patients. So these are the sort of sources of real world data: non-interventional studies or observational studies, patient chart reviews, which I guess a lot of us have been involved with audit, surveys, mobile health and wearable tech, and that's an increasingly important source of data. Health claims databases, particularly in the United States, a lot of very good research in psoriasis has come out of the health claims databases, and then patient registries, which we're going to talk about today. And you say, well, what's the advantage of having real-world evidence compared with randomized controlled trials, RCTs? Well, they take less time to set up and they are not as costly, but they're still quite expensive if you have very big studies. They have a much longer observation period, which is crucial. And they can do research which is just not possible with a randomized controlled trial. So you could do research in high-risk groups, people who wouldn't go into randomized trials, such as older patients, patients with comorbidities, patients on multiple different medicines, and it addresses data gaps in patients who are not eligible for those reasons. And it can also detect rare side effects, but very important side effects. That's one of the reasons that one of the early biologics for psoriasis was withdrawn, is because significant side effects were discovered, which had not been picked up in the early randomized trials. But there are limitations. You need very large data sets, so it takes a time for you to get up to speed before you can analyze the data. There's a high possibility of bias, which may lead to reduced data quality. They're not randomized, but that's okay. And there's a lack of standardization across settings, that you can try and standardize as much as possible, as we've done in the UK with Bad Beer. And there's a potential for limited comprehensive clinical data across healthcare settings, because not everyone can collect the same amount of information. But taking that into account, it's certainly worth going into registries. Now, Bad Beer, you may be wondering what I'm talking about, and it's just to sort of make sure that you're orientated. So this is not a poorly performing brewery. Bad Beer is in fact the British Association of Dermatologists, it's BAD, Biologics and Immunomodulators Register. And it was called the Biologics Interventions Register when we started, but then the immunomodulators such as the Premalas came along, so we felt we needed to incorporate that as well. And this is a large prospective cohort study examining the long-term safety of new therapies for psoriasis. And it's the National Register for UK and the Republic of Ireland. So the rationale is that biologic therapies have been tested for safety in clinical trials over a relatively short period of time. But we set it up to assess the long-term safety of biologics and new therapies following a real-world population from the UK and Ireland, and incorporating large academic centres and small district general hospitals. So there's a real cross-section of clinics that are contributing to this information. We're picking, it's men and women, all age groups, a significant diversity of population, different occupations, people who are well, people who are unwell, people who are in the hospital, people who are overweight, people who are underweight, and of course people who drink and smoke. And of course, in managing psoriasis, a lot of our patients do drink and smoke and are overweight and are on polypharmacy. So, this has to be fit for purpose. And we are studying patients with plaque psoriasis. So the aim was to investigate long-term outcomes of psoriasis patients treated with these new therapies, but our primary endpoints when we set this up were malignancy, risk of melanoma, infection, a serious infection requiring hospitalization or IV antimicrobials, serious adverse events, and death. So the statistical statistical power was set to those parameters. And the study design is that we have the biologic cohort, and notice that there's a large number of biologics that we're studying now, and we're also naming them by their proprietary name, because we have to take into account the biosimilars, which have now come into the market, particularly for the anti-TNFs, and in a year or so's time will come in for ustekinumab. We've got a control group of conventional patients on conventional treatments, such as methotrexate and cyclosporin, and a small molecule group, dimethyl fumarate and apremilast. And these patients must all be biologic naive before they come into these three cohorts. And they have to conform to the UK criteria of having a psoriasis area severity index of at least 10 and a DLQI, dermatology life quality index, of greater than 10. So they have to mirror clinical practice. And this is observational study design. So we're following them up, for as long as they stay in the register for many years in some cases. Initially, it's a 6-monthly follow-up for the first 3 years, then goes to annual. Patient-reported measures lifestyle, initially 6 months for the first 3 years, and then it stops at that stage. And then it's linked to UK and national records, so we can track cancers, deaths, and inpatient hospital admissions. So this is the timeline. We first started talking about it back in 2005, 2006, when the NICE, who approved biologics in the UK for psoriasis at that time, felt that we should start to look at safety. And we actually entered our first patients in 2007. I've had the privilege to be the chief investigator for this registry since its inception in 2007. And we're now out to 2022. And it's been a tremendous experience. It's been a real showcase of what's best about UK collaborative research in dermatology, and also the NHS, the National Health Service. We have 164 centres have recruited to Bad Beer across the UK and Ireland, so large and small. And even in the last year, 133 centres recorded follow-up data. So that's very impressive when you think about the COVID pandemic. And our registrations, as of a couple of days ago, we have over 20,000 total registrations, 14,000 biologics, 6,000 in that conventional comparison cohort, and that's a much smaller number in that small molecule cohort. But this is a very large number of patients now with many patient years. And the question is, we've been running this for 14, 15 years now. Why is it still important? Well, there's even more treatments available for moderate to severe psoriasis, new ones coming all the time. And also there's a cumulative exposure to many different products. And it could be that being exposed to combinations of different biologics over time might actually bring out important adverse events. So this is, as things are at the moment, have over 95,000 follow-up visits recorded, 140,000 passes, 68,000 adverse events. Now, this requires a big team. The team's based in Manchester, working on behalf of the British Association of Dermatologists. We have 15 people working in the team, led by our program manager, Ian Evans. And we also include children. I think this is very important. As you know, biologics are now approved in children, and we've been using systemic therapies for children for a number of years. but there's no age restriction for bad beer registrations. And I think it's very important in this group to evaluate the long-term safety where there's an immature immune system. And once they move all the way through, there's no separate pediatric register. And it's important because, still important in 2022, because rare adverse events may require many persons' years of follow-up. So that's why we want to keep patients in this register as long as possible. And of course, there's an interest in the emerging events with COVID-19 and this immunosuppressed patients or immunomodulated patients. And our next data cut will be in April, where we'll have about 750 patients who have been COVID positive and are in our register. It's a fantastic platform for pharmacoepidemiology research. We've had external fellows from Thailand, Egypt, clinical research training fellowships from the Medical Research Council, senior research fellowships, and a number of research associates funded by Bad Bear. And we now have 29 publications which have emanated from the study. But remember, it took a number of years before we could publish anything. The sort of safety data that we've got, we've been able to show that patients who are ineligible for clinical trials have more adverse events than those who are eligible. So that shows the importance of real-world data. No increased risk for serious infection compared to conventional treatments, which is important, except for infliximab, where there's a definite increased risk of serious infection. But also important, there's no increased risk for cancer, no increased risk for keratinocyte cancers compared with conventional therapies, and no increase in risk for major cardiovascular events, which are all very reassuring. As I mentioned, we did this study, Katie Mason in our group did this study looking at patients who are eligible or ineligible for a randomized controlled trial, but were in Bad Bear to see if there were differences. And if you use the typical eligibility criteria, what we found was that those patients who would be ineligible for a clinical trial, maybe too old or comorbidities, had lower effectiveness and higher rates of serious adverse events. So that's why it's important to look at real world data. It's going to give you different outcomes than you would find in randomized controlled trials. We've done a number of studies where we looked at drug survival. That's how long a patient can stay on a drug once they start a biologic. And this is one of our most recent studies where we've shown that secukinumab and ustekinumab had similar sustained drug survival, while adalimumab, this red line here, has lower drug survival in patients with psoriasis. And we showed that psoriatic arthritis and previous biologic experience were predictors with differential effects between the biological therapies. We've also we can use Bad Bear to actually emulate clinical trials that wouldn't do in the real world. And Zenas Hughes, one of our key people in the team, is one of our consultants now in Manchester, is a lecturer in the National Institute for Health Research lecturer. And he's been able to, using the eligibility criteria, so able to rerun in Bad Bear a study that had been done as a randomized controlled trial, secukinumab against ustekinumab. And what he found was that the effectiveness was less than we found in the real world for both of those drugs, but secukinumab had superior effectiveness. So what this tells you is that you can actually run studies which would never be funded, say methotrexate against ustekinumab, for instance, or methotrexate against the apremilast. We have enough patients in to do these studies within Bad Bear. But this setting up Bad Bear has influenced other studies and other registries, such as the eczema registry we have in the UK now, stratification SORT, which is psoriasis stratification of optimized relevant therapy, study run by Catherine Smith at King's College London, the biomarkers of systemic treatment outcomes in psoriasis, which is gathering DNA and sera and in our patients in Bad Bear. And we have about 8,000 patients now of those 20,000 where we have that information. So SORT would not have happened without Bad Bear. And what SORT is about is, can we predict which patients, if they're given a biologic, are going to respond, which ones are not going to respond, and which few are going to get side effects. And using this sort of Bad Bear approach, and actually a collaboration between industry and academic centres in the UK and the Psoriasis Association, we want to see whether we can predict which biologic is best for which patient using various criteria, but this is just usually 3 bits of information. We can pick up non-adherence on biologics. So patients on biologics also don't adhere to treatment the same as they don't do to methotrexate or cyclosporin. So we can pick that up and identify those patients early on. We've been able to show, doing some nice work, comparing, looking at that B-stop data and looking at genomics, that patients who are HLA-CW6 positive are more likely to respond to ustekinumab and get a very good result, PASI 90, that's 90% improvement, than those who are negative. And also just looking at those clinical areas. People are overweight, they have psoriasis on the palms or soles, if they've been a smoker, and if they're female, less likely to have a very good response to a biologic. And then just to close, of course, almost exactly 2 years ago, COVID was started to appear around the world, and immediately we asked, well, what is the course of COVID-19 in people with psoriasis, and what is the course of psoriasis in the context of COVID-19? So we very quickly set up a register within a matter of about 2 or 3 weeks, and this was because of Satvir Marhill and Catherine Smith at St. John's really took this forward, and it was a privilege for me to be involved in the executive team for this. So this is for clinicians globally to report outcomes of suspected or confirmed COVID-19 in people with psoriasis. This is the team. It's a huge international effort. Dr. Freeman is part of the study team. And So Protect is the first register, which is around looking at the patients, the clinicians reporting information. Currently, we have 1,369 registrants as of yesterday. This is the sort of data that we've got out of this. So we've published a number of different studies now. The first one is the key one, which showed that risk factors for hospitalization with people with psoriasis are more likely if they're male, older age, non-white ethnicity, or had other health conditions. So mirroring what we see in the general population. But very interestingly, they were less likely to be hospitalized if they were on a biologic therapy. And then we've looked at the shielding behavior of people with psoriasis or musculoskeletal conditions, and they're more likely to shield. That means that they are isolating. If they're male, they have joint disease. If they're anxious or depressed, and that's an important thing that's coming out of these studies, is that people are very anxious or depressed. And then So Protect Me is a study, a registry that we set up about a couple of months later, which is around patients being able to input their data, not whether they've had COVID-19 or not, but their experiences of the pandemic. And this is closely aligned with So Protect. It's been a fantastic global effort. We have over 5,000 registrants now, majority from Northern Europe, but many countries, I think about 30, 40 countries now around the world who've registered data. And this is the sort of information we're getting out of this. So this is sort of softer, but very important data when you're managing patients with psoriasis in the background of a COVID pandemic. So risk factors for worsening psoriasis if they were shielding, they're obese, they're female, anxious or depressed, not taking psoriasis treatment. So interestingly, so a little bit different than what we saw for those patients who are going to be hospitalized if they got COVID. So what can Bad Beer do? Well, it's a fantastic training resource. It's open to anyone who wants to access the data. We're very keen to hear from people from around the world. You just have to I'll show you the contact details in a moment. So apply for data access, and we have the team to help you interrogate that data if we believe that the research question that you're asking is new and exciting and different from ones that we've tried to answer before. And then this is where we're based. This is where I'm sitting here today. It's not, the weather is not like this normally in Manchester. That's the one day out of the last couple of years where it looked like that, where we took the opportunity. And this is the team who's happy to take your questions and advise you about how you can access the data. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you very much, Professor Griffiths. We'll just wait for Dr. Esther Freeman to load up her slides. But in the meantime, I was just wanting to remind everyone, if you have any questions, any comments, just pop them in the chat. And we've got 20 minutes at the end of the meeting today to put them to our speakers and have them respond. But really, really wonderful overview of Bad Beer and the other associated registries. Thank you, Prof.
Great, thank you so much. That was fabulous. And I'm like, meanwhile, taking notes, even though I'm involved in some of these efforts, hearing you talk about it, Dr. Griffiths, is just really inspiring to see, how much we can learn from really kind of real time and real world data analysis. So I want to take, and I love it because I saw in the chat already a question about like, how can we do this as a trainee? What's the red tape involved with setting up a registry? So I'm going to take you through, first, I'm actually just going to talk a little bit about career stuff, because this is in GlowDerm, our very first webinar where it's kind of more aimed at like career development. And so I actually wanted to take you through just a little bit of my story of kind of how I got where I am. And then I actually want to take you through some very practical tips about how to set something like this up. So first of all, I just wanted to introduce myself as the chair of GlowDerm. And, I feel like my job is to really give people opportunities and then get out of the way and let really wonderful people like Sidra and her team do their thing. And so I think that it's important to think about just really setting out to do what you love. And I think the rest will kind of come. And so I wanted to give you a little bit of my sense of my journey here, as I said, since our kind of first chance to have a little bit of a career chat with our GlowDerm team. So my father was actually a professor of infectious diseases at Harvard, and I would travel with him frequently when he went to conferences. And I remember one of my very first experiences in global health, we were in rural China, and we were looking around and trying to understand. And he asked me, I think I was, this is probably not a normal question to like a 10-year-old, but this is what it was like growing up with my dad. He asked me, how would you be able to evaluate people's socioeconomic status just by looking at people on the street? And at the time, there were not, where we were, there were not a lot of cars, a lot of bicycles, since that wasn't a great way. And we realized that looking at people's wrists and presence of wristwatches, for example, could be a sign of socioeconomic status. And so it was just being able to observe the real world around you and kind of think about how you would measure and evaluate things. I then ended up doing my PhD at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And if you haven't been to this building in London, if you ever are in London, I highly recommend it. It's one of the only public health buildings I know that has disease vectors around the entire outside of the building. And so each balcony has a different disease vector on it. And I found my way to dermatology in actually an unlikely place. So my background was really in public health and HIV. And I was working in a rural clinic in Lesotho. At the time, the clinic we were working in did not have any roads. So we were dropped off by airplane, and our supplies were resupplied by airplane once a week. And at the time, we were bringing antiretroviral therapy to this rural area for the first time. It was an area very, very hard hit by HIV and AIDS. And my background at this point was I was an epidemiologist. And what happened was all of our patients were coming in because we had such little access to labs. We were seeing patients doing a physical exam, but you couldn't easily get a CD4 count on someone or a viral load on someone at this time because the plane would come once a week. And maybe if you really, really desperately needed it, you could send blood to the capital city, but there wasn't a routine way to do this kind of lab testing on site. And so what we ended up doing was, you would really use your eyes and your skills to realize that you could kind of get a sense of someone's immune system just by, their presentation on their skin. Obviously, better to do a CD4 count than a viral load, but when you don't have that option, you really need to kind of use your other skills. And so that was actually my interest in my introduction to dermatology, was being in the field and realizing that we can use the skin as kind of a window into people's kind of immunologic soul, which I think has been very true for COVID-19 as well. And I think just a word about mentorship, and this is something that's really important to me and something that we're working really hard in GlowDerm to set up, is more opportunities for mentorship. I was lucky enough to have Toby Maurer, who's one of our HIV dermatologists, be one of my mentors. And during even my training, I started working at the World Health Organization in Geneva, looking at developing guidelines for HIV and AIDS dermatologic skin conditions. So I think mentorship is so important. So in terms of, again, this is in my mind, a little bit of a career talk as we think about how our careers develop over time. I trained in my dermatology residency at Harvard, ended up getting smaller grants that then, grow into bigger grants, the Dermatology Foundation Career Development Award. I'm now funded by the National Institute of Health, and that brings me where I am today. So I direct global health for our department. I'm the chair of GlowDerm. And we've just recently, this past couple of weeks, which we're really excited about, at the British Journal of Dermatology, launched a new section on global health and equity, which I think will really provide a home for a lot of the work that people do in global health. I'm also the principal investigator of the COVID-19 Dermatology Registry for the American Academy of Dermatology and International League of Derm Societies, which I will talk about in a little bit. But I think it's important, sometimes it can be, you look at people, like Dr. Griffiths, and you think, wow, he's had this hugely successful career, like this is amazing. He must not have gotten anything ever wrong or rejected. And I'm going to guess, since Dr. Griffiths is in academia, that he's actually had many rejections of things. And hopefully I'm not misspeaking here, Dr. Griffiths, but I think all of us in academia have actually had, you know, many rejections and things that don't work out. And so I wanted to actually talk a little bit about academic resilience. And so this is not my idea, but this is a wonderful concept. It's called the CV of failures. So all of us, when we put forward our CVs, I think it tends to be, you know, our good things that we've done, and you don't see all the messiness behind. So I just want to point out that when you look at someone, you know, like Dr. Griffiths, or other people that have been successful in dermatology, behind that is a whole lot of effort and probably a whole lot of failures, and you do have to kind of bounce back. So I love this. This is his CV of failures. This is a professor. I love it. He lists all the PhD programs he didn't get into, the academic positions and fellowships that he didn't get, and, you know, number of papers that were rejected, and the research funding I didn't get. And I love the last meta failure, and this is available. This is a professor at Princeton University in the United States. His last meta failure was that his CV of failures actually received more attention than his entire body of academic work. So I just wanted to bring your attention to this, to realize that, you know, people can look really glossy, especially in kind of the social media world that we live in. But behind that is, you know, people really push through, and you have, as an academic, a lot of rejections and failures that are part of your life. So I thought I would share some of my CV of failures, just to kind of make this a little bit more approachable. The first time I submitted an NIH grant, it didn't get funded. I've had a paper rejected in as fast as 6 hours. The longest time I've ever worked on a paper that didn't get, hasn't been published yet today is 9 years. I have once left my passport in a hotel safe while traveling. Countless, I couldn't even count the number of scholarship applications. We've had lots successfully funded and many not. And I think one other example is, now I do a lot of work with the press around COVID-19, and you can spend a lot of time with the press and they don't always choose to quote you exactly the way you expect. So I just wanted to kind of peel the onion a little bit and talk about, sometimes, you know, you do have to just keep trying. If you get rejected, you kind of pick yourself up and you try again, and you repackage another way. The last thing I want to say is about mentorship. I call this my smoothie approach to mentorship, which is, I think you need more than one mentor. I think it is unlikely that one person out there is going to have exactly the career you want. And in fact, that would be kind of boring if they did, right? And so the way I think about it is that your mentors are these different ingredients. You might have a clinical mentor who really inspires you and is a wonderful diagnostician, is going to teach you great clinical dermatology. You might have a research mentor, or someone that you look up to that can really help you with the research. It's unlikely to be one person. So think about your mentorship as a panel and a team, and the ultimate result is you, that unique smoothie, that unique blend of all those things. And so I have a unique blend of different mentors that have affected who I am today. Now, I know that, and last point I will make about kind of mentorship is that if you do have the opportunity to get methods training, this is something that I think is really critical. And I've never, ever in my life heard someone say, wow, I wish I had less methods training. So if there is a chance to get methods training in statistics, in biology, in project design, in methods in terms of setting up a study, these are all incredibly useful life skills that you will carry with you. So keeping your eye out for these opportunities is really helpful. Okay, now I know this is supposed to be a registries talk, and that was like, I went off into career land for a few minutes, but because this is our first GloDerm webinar looking at kind of career opportunities, I wanted to just take a moment to discuss that. So I think, we are all living through COVID-19 together. This is as of early February. We're at 380 million confirmed cases of COVID-19, over 5 million deaths, and 10 billion vaccine doses, which is really incredible. So what we did early in the pandemic, much like Dr. Griffiths mentioned, that they did with TSO Protect, is that we looked around and realized that we really needed a way globally to capture skin manifestations of COVID-19. And to be honest, at the very beginning, it wasn't even obvious to us that there would be skin manifestations of COVID-19. If you remember back to 2019, right before this really kind of exploded everywhere, reports coming out of China really were focusing understandably on the respiratory effects, and there were very few reports about skin disease. So very rapidly, in a period of 8 days, we developed and programmed this registry with the idea that we would capture both people who are dermatologic patients already who might get COVID-19, and then also patients who were developing new skin manifestations of COVID-19. So I think what Dr. Griffiths already covered this very well is that registries are great for global reach. They bring together disparate observations. So for example, you could be sitting, I could be sitting in Boston and I might see one patient, and by itself seeing one patient, with a morbilliform eruption in the setting of, new onset COVID-19 might not mean that much. But if you are also sitting in Lagos and you see the same thing, and you're also seeing in Johannesburg and you see the same thing, or you're sitting in London and you see the same thing, as you bring these disparate observations together, it can really start to create some hypothesis generation, some noise. And I think Dr. Griffiths also covered really well the challenges that you really cannot tell population-based incidence or prevalence. There's no denominator. So I like to think of a registry as almost a really, really giant case series. So in terms of the COVID-19 Dermatology Registry, it's a collaboration between the American Academy of Dermatology and the International League of Dermatologic Societies. And I should mention that we're very grateful to the International League of Derm Societies for providing grant funding to help us run this project. And the American Academy of Dermatology provides in-kind support. So we launched this in the very beginning of April. And as I said, it was a super rapid process. This is a time when everything was moving so quickly. From when we proposed the idea to the AAD to launching the registry was 8 days, which has included basically 2 overnights by one of my students really rapidly programming. And we also went through ethics review in that time period. And I think the collaboration across the global, really across the globe in terms of dermatologists working together on this was incredible. And so, for example, I reached out to Dr. Griffiths, who was just working on launching PSO Protect, and people were so willing to collaborate and to share best practice and how to, I even approached, there was a team also at Harvard that was involved in the Global Rheumatology Alliance. And they were about 6 days ahead of us in terms of launching their registry to the rheumatology community. And in COVID time, 6 days was like a lot, it was like a year because things were moving so quickly at the beginning of the pandemic. And so we could say, listen, what did you do for your IRB application? How did you get that through? And they were so willing to share. And I think that really global sense of sharing and moving forward towards a common goal rapidly was so important. So within a first month after launch, we had 500 cases of COVID skin manifestations. We added on in December of 2020, the addition of COVID-19 vaccine skin reactions. And so one challenge with this registry is that we're constantly reprogramming it because COVID is changing constantly. And let me tell you, if I knew what the registry would look like now, I never would have programmed it the way we programmed it in the beginning, because literally we're just changing it constantly. And so now when you look at the data, it's this very complicated web, but it's because we had to continually in real time reprogram it. So we are now at over 2,500 total reports, and these are reported by healthcare providers. So these are not patient entered, these are healthcare provider entered. So this is much more like the original PSO Protect that Dr. Griffiths was talking about, and not the PSO Protect Me, which is the patient oriented. So this is really from healthcare providers. Over 1,000 of these are from vaccine reactions, and this comes from 52 different countries across the globe and all continents except Antarctica. So I think that what you can see, the data that we've generated from this worldwide effort from all these different countries has really enabled us to have rapid publication and collaborative accumulation of knowledge at a time when there was just a knowledge vacuum. We had no idea what COVID was going to look like on the skin and for our patients. And so we started out publishing on Pernio and COVID toes. We published on long COVID. We've looked at timing of testing. We've looked at reactions after vaccination. So just a real big range of different topics. And the key for us has been rapid turnaround to the front line. And I think what we've also tried to do is work together among different registries. And so this is, as you can see, a project that involved Dr. Griffiths, where we've actually harmonized across different registries that all had components of COVID-19. So this is a list of dermatologic registries in COVID-19. So the American Academy of Dermatology and the International League of Derm Societies registry is the one that we run, where I'm the principal investigator. And these are the days that these are the dates that these registries first went live. Secure Alopecia is a registry regarding hair loss and COVID-19. Secure AD relates to atopic dermatitis. You've already heard about PSO Protect and PSO Protect Me. Secure Psoriasis was an additional one. And then hidradenitis suppurativa has its own registry, and PEDRA, which is the pediatric derm community, also has its own registry. So I think this gives you a sense of the different registries and that we're really working together cumulatively. And actually this number has really increased because as the self-reported psoriasis cases have gone up. So at least when we wrote this paper, it was 8,000 case reports from physicians and patients all over the world. So I think it's just really demonstrates an unprecedented level of collaboration across the dermatologic community. So I wanted to share some practical tips before I end about doing research as a trainee. And I talk a lot to our residents here at Harvard. And really the idea is that research is possible as a trainee. And, as someone who is not a bench scientist, I am definitely an epidemiologist, not a bench scientist, and pipettes kind of scare me a little bit, I'll be honest. Is that sometimes research, when you think about doing bench science, you can think about that as a very high bar for entry and very challenging. But I will say in the population sciences, a lot of data already exists, and people like Dr. Griffiths and ourselves have data that are, it's possible to obtain and work from. So I think that a lot of this research really is possible as a trainee, and I want to just lower that bar and make you realize that this is something that you can do. So I think the first thing to think about is your ethics application. And so this really is your first step, is you need to obviously know what your project is, but you do need to go through an ethics approval. Now, it may be that your IRB, which is your institutional review board at your local institution, they may ultimately deem that what you're doing is potentially not human subjects research, but you still need to go through this process, and they need to actually tell you that formally themselves. So this is just an example from UCSF, one of our institutions in the US that I thought had a nice little checklist for the IRB. So does your research require IRB review? Pretty much the answer is always going to be yes, but it may not require a full review. So that's just something to think about. Sometimes you can do an expedited review if you're just doing, for example, record review. Most places will not have, so PI stands for principal investigator. Most places won't let a student necessarily be a principal investigator. So you will need to link up with a faculty member in your institution in order to be able to submit an IRB application. Now, this, of course, really comes to the fundamental of all of it, is that you really need to know what your research question is. It needs to be specific. It needs to be doable. And I think there's a lot of wonderful resources online to help you think through generating your research question and how to develop a good research question that's novel and answerable. I think then once you have your research question placed, you need to think about what data you need to answer that research question. And now it may turn out, doing a new study and generating new data is very expensive and can be very time consuming. So it's very possible that what you might want to do, the data might already exist for this. And I'll just give you a few examples of publicly available data. So Google Trends, for example, what people are searching for using search engines, is available publicly, and that's data that you can access. Another great example of data that's available is the Global Burden of Disease data. This is the GBD project. And so if you look at the Global Burden of Disease project, there is just a ton of data that you can request and download. And there is some information on skin in that data set. So that's totally freely available. The World Health Organization also has data that's available on different topics. And then what we're talking about today are these existing registries in dermatology. And the American Academy of Dermatology registry, the AAD-ILDS Dermatology COVID-19 registry, much like the registry that Dr. Griffiths was talking about, has a data request process whereby if you give us a research question and we feel that it's scientifically sound, we are able to share that data with you. So I wanted to show you, so if you look at the registry, the AAD-ILDS COVID-19 Dermatology Registry, we are at aad.org/COVID registry. You will see that under the FAQ, or the frequently asked questions, we have a registry data request process. Now, we do require that you have a statistician on your team, just because the data that we have is pretty complex. And we do have you fill out an entire application about what you want to do, and then we review it. We have a data governance work group that will review your application. But if successful, we are able to share that data with you. And I know there was a question, I think on Twitter, about data sharing and data access. And so this goes through a process by where once it's been approved and we know that you have your own IRB approval that will cover your work, there's something called a data use agreement that is drawn up between the two institutions in order to transfer data formally. And then I think we talked about registries, but there's a lot of different kinds of research that can be covered in different types of IRB applications. And as I mentioned, that registry work may not actually be human subjects work. You still have to submit the application. And depending on if these cases are completely de-identified, it may be exempted from full review, but you still need a letter that says that the ethics committee has approved your use of this data, even if it does not ultimately be deemed as human subjects research. You can't really make that decision your own and say, oh, it's fine, it's not human subjects. Like, you actually need the ethics committee to tell you that. I think when you think about collecting your data, I wanted to just introduce you to this concept of something called REDCap. REDCap is a secure platform that we use for a lot of data collection. And I don't know, Dr. Griffiths, if you guys use REDCap for any of your PSO Protect platforms. This is what we use for the AAD and the ILDS COVID-19 registry. I do not recommend using SurveyMonkey as a research tool. This is something that people might use to like set up a meeting, but in terms of actually collecting data for a research study, this is generally considered non-secure. And I just wanted to introduce you to the concept of REDCap. REDCap is available worldwide. I'm going to show you how to access it. This is our REDCap here at Harvard. There's just a login screen. You basically create a new REDCap project. This is going to be a database where you can put data in, and you can actually send links out to people, or there can be a website link and people can enter cases. This is looking under the hood of our registry. This is all run by REDCap. So once you create a new REDCap project, you'll actually see, and this is just an example project, different registry IDs, and then you'll have all the different data that they fill out in this dashboard. And this is an example. It's actually pretty easy to set up a registry or a project in REDCap. It's a pretty intuitive system, and there are a lot of YouTube videos online on how to train yourself to do REDCap, but this is something you can definitely learn on your own. I think there's a lot of great features where you can force people to answer certain questions so you don't get a lot of data error on the back end. And in terms of if you have not used REDCap before, if you go onto the REDCap website, there's a whole information about how to get started with REDCap. And there are 145 different countries have REDCap access through over 5,000 institutions. Now, I just chose one country in Sub-Saharan Africa just to look at to see what the partners were. So I just typed in Botswana, for example. And in Botswana, there are 3 different institutions that have access to REDCap. So no matter where you are in the world, I would encourage you to put in your own country and you'll see the list of institutions that have REDCap access. So I think that my final slide is just to say that research as a trainee is absolutely possible. The data might already exist. Maybe you don't need to collect data yourself, and you might be able to just request the data that you want. If you do need to collect new data or start your own registry, I would definitely encourage you to use REDCap. It tends to be free for partner institutions, and there are many institutions around the world that are involved with REDCap. And find your mentors. And so we are very excited at Gloderm that probably in the next month or so at our AAD pre-meeting, we are going to be announcing a new mentorship program that we're rolling out. It's not live yet, so stay tuned. Please sign up for a newsletter if you aren't part of it already, and we'll be sharing more information about how to apply for a mentorship program coming up. Thanks so much. Oh, and I should say, keep entering cases in the registry if you haven't. There's our website. We're looking at long COVID vaccine reactions and boosters. And a huge thank you to our massive registry team across the entire world, and especially the International League of Derm Societies. And thank you to our ILDS staff and our Gloderm Trainee Committee today.
That was wonderful, Esther. Thank you so much. And lots of really great practical tips on how to actually get started as a trainee. So I think Rachel has some questions she wants to get started with, if that's okay.
Yep. Thank you guys both for your presentations. So I'm just going to go quickly because keep mind of time. So one individual from Nigeria said that they definitely need a dermatosis registry in their country, but they would like feedback from either one of you of how to get started without too much red tape or trouble or barriers.
Yeah, and I think hopefully, I think I saw that question before my talk, so I think hopefully we addressed a little bit. I think the first step is to really think about, what kind of data you're collecting and who you're collecting it from. So is this from patients? Is this from physicians? Because that's going to set up a little bit differently. So you need to think about what your research questions are. And then I think you really do need to start pretty early with the ethics approval process, because you will have to go through that process before launching it. And then I think REDCap is one example. And I would suggest, if you're thinking about countrywide, working with your national society is a really great way, so that if it's something that you're expecting dermatologists, for example, across Nigeria to use, I think you're really going to want, even before you start, to get buy-in from very high levels at your national society that this is something that they will buy into and, promote.
That's
yeah,
great.
if I could just add to that, I think absolutely REDCap would be, it's such a great system. But my advice would be to start start simply. Keep it simple to begin with. So you've got something to build on. Don't try and do everything straight off, because you're going to get frustrated. I think just try and get something set up, some simple questions, simple information, and then you can start to build on it.
And can I ask, just sort of building on from that, a lot of the questions pre-submitted and during this talk have focused on practical advice on how to get started. And, looking at, these examples we were given, they're all, fantastic examples of how, how to go about doing it. But in terms of, putting the team together, because it's not a one-man job, what do you guys think about key personnel when thinking about, setting up, and we're thinking about key personnel who should, of course, Esther, you mentioned, if we're going through institutions for ethics application, we obviously need to have faculty members on board, and you mentioned briefly as well about, statisticians being on board. So maybe talk a bit about the key sort of key players in your team that you need to have at the sort of beginning stages.
Well, I think from my side, I mean, the most important thing is to have an enthusiastic team who are committed to the project, because it's never going to be easy. I guess for me, the two key people are the program manager. However, that's the person who's going to do all this, a lot of the admin work, keep the whole show on the road. But that's important. You've got to have someone who's going to do that work, and often the academics and the clinicians don't have the time. So if you could afford to have someone to do that, to help you with that, that would be very important. But also, and what really was useful for us in Manchester, because we actually set up our own databases. We don't use REDCap. We actually designed our own system, which is now being used in other registries. But is to have someone who really understands how to put a database together, an electronic database. And the first one we tried, the second one we tried, they were not that good. But then we got a guy who's been with us ever since for the last 12 years who just did it, and he is spectacularly good. So yeah, someone who understands the how to put a database together and how to maintain it.
I agree, and I think there is a little bit of build it when they will come. I 100% agree that having someone who can program it kind of correctly, because if you program a database incorrectly in the beginning, you're going to be feeling the ramifications of that kind of forever. So it is really important to have someone involved early on who understands database management and the pitfalls, and that can help you program it appropriately. Because as I said, REDCap is easy to teach yourself, but to be able to do it well and to create a good database, I think that's really, essential. And then, it may, as you said, as Dr. Griffiths said, maybe you're starting small. And so we don't actually, to be honest, I'm actually kind of embarrassed to say this, is that for the AAD-ILDS registry, we actually don't have a separate program manager. We just manage it, as a team, although probably that's a good plan. But I think part of that came up with the fact that we had to do it so quickly. So I think it really depends on how fast you're trying to do something. With COVID, we were moving, like one day in COVID years, the beginning of COVID was like 6 months any other time of the year. So we're just moving so quickly. We had to be really nimble and really fast. I think now if I were setting something up, I would take my time. And probably is the way that, with psoriasis registries, being able to do it a little bit more, taking your time. And so I think it depends. If you're responding to an international crisis, it has to happen a little faster.
Thank you so much for those responses. So the next question I have is, how does one find a way to advocate or provide awareness for a community or individuals to participate and engage in a patient disease registry when medical mistrust has impacted some marginalized communities of the world?
Yeah, I think this is, yeah, it's hugely important, a hugely important and insightful question, to which I maybe don't have the world's best answer. I think that as much as possible, involving people from communities in the registry development, I think, and in the registry team, I think would be really, really important. And I actually think we could probably do a better job of this ourselves. And then I think also finding who are the key opinion and thought leaders in different communities. And so, for us, we've reached out through, for example, the Skin of Color Society to try to encourage more involvement. But if you look at our registry papers, this is a huge problem for us. The majority of patients that are reported in the AAD and ILDS registry are white, which is not representative of the world and it's not representative of the COVID pandemic. So I don't know, Dr. Griffiths, you might have some more insight to add.
Yeah, so one of the, it's not strictly a registry, but the other thing I ran, which when Cedar very kindly introduced me, is the Global Psoriasis Atlas, which is sort of a repository of information about psoriasis, and this is around epidemiology particularly. And Sidra knows, because we've done a couple of some field work. If you want to collect information, say the study we did out in Masailand in Tanzania, Sidra, you have to. It has to be collaborative. It has to be collaborative with the local dermatologist, the local team. You've got to talk to the local people ahead of time, and often there's an influential person in that village who can talk to them about the importance of the work that they're going to be the work that they're going to be involved with, i.e., coming to a site where people can get information about their skin disease. And you've got to make it sustainable as well, because it's no point just going in there, doing a study, and that's it, you're out. It's got to be, you've got to set in place the sustainability, which really means having colleagues back there in that country who are working as an equal member of the team to make it happen. And but my experience is that people, if it's just being an affable person who's able to communicate. They realize you're not something special, you're there to help them, and it's to their benefit, and it's going to benefit others with their diseases. That's what we've learned with putting the psoriasis atlas together.
Thank you so much. And the last question I have before I give it to Sidra to take on is, what do you think makes a good mentee, and how do you identify which students or trainees are the best fit to take on if you are a mentor?
Yeah, challenging, because there's so many wonderful folks out there that would be absolutely wonderful to mentor. And I think one thing I've learned about myself is that I can't, if I try to mentor too many people at the same time, then I do a disservice to the people that I am taking on. So I do kind of have limits of number of people I will mentor per year. I think in terms of being a good mentee is often, it's a very active relationship. So for example, even with my mentor, who's a professor of infectious diseases here at Harvard, who I meet with once a month, when I come into a meeting, I actually have an agenda of what I want to cover. And you have to think about your mentor's time as kind of this golden time that they're giving you, and that you need to really use it wisely. So when I meet with my mentors, I have a plan of, look, okay, she's going to give me an hour. What do I need her brain for an hour? And so that it doesn't take this just kind of free form discussion, you're really driving the priorities and what you need. So I think it depends a little bit on everybody about how they choose mentees. For me, I usually require that someone who's considering spending a year with me actually has to come and spend some advanced time in Boston, and we can make sure that it's going to be a good fit, because I invest so much time in people when they are spending a year with me. But I will say, just to say that as a mentee, I think it's a very active process of understanding what you need from your mentor, understanding that they're going to have limited time, and how do you make best use of that time. But Dr. Griffiths, you might have some other thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I've been involved with mentoring for a number of years. The European Society of Dermatological Research would run mentoring programs, and I think what I'd be looking for in a mentee, I mean, I don't think there's such thing as good and bad. It's someone, you've got to make sure it's got someone who's got to be curious, enthusiastic about what they're doing. They've got to have a passion for it, for their subject. And you can sometimes find out very early on that someone who's doing research is actually working in the wrong area because they thought it was a smart or a sexy thing to be doing, working in some particular disease, where really they're much more interested in another one, which may not be so sexy or interesting to other people, but they can actually make a real difference to it. So go with where the heart is. I think it's important. But a mentor needs to be, you can't, I think the important thing about a mentor is that they can't be a research collaborator. They're not part of the research team. They can stand to one side and they can give unalloyed advice that the individual needs to hear rather than that they want to hear. If you understand the difference. So it's being taking a very objective view and answering the questions honestly, because there are going to be a lot of questions there. But also the mentee's got to feel that they trust the mentor, that they're not going to be talking to other people about what their issues are. They're going to give them their undivided, equitable attention. And of course, you need different mentors for different stages of your career. You can't have the same person all the way through. Exactly as Dr. Freeman was saying, they need that sort of blend. That's the important thing.
Thank you so much. I'll hand it over to Dr. Sidra for the remaining questions.
Thank you. Well, that is our hour. So we will just look to wrap it up. But that was a really good final question because it leads on to a nice little plug for our April webinar, which is focusing on medical education, and we'll have Professor Minnie Singh actually specifically discussing the value of good mentorship and the difference between mentorship and supervision. And in the context of this, global health setting. So be sure to sign up for that. And I'm sure a lot more interesting discussion, will follow that as well. But I really just want to take a minute to thank Esther Freeman and Chris Griffiths again today for taking the time to chat to us all today. We've learned so much, and the discussion has been really valuable as well. And I think we have covered, most of the questions that have been asked. And yeah, thank you once again. Really inspiring from both of you, and really, just getting us all really motivated and excited about, getting stuck into work like this. So thank you very much.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for having us, Citra.
And thank you everybody for attending and participating and sharing your questions and comments. And of course, the team at the IFT for helping as well behind the scenes. Thank you, everyone. And we'll see you next month.
Bye. Bye.